Today we are going to discuss domain and range. There are three different types of notations for domain and range. The first is set notation. There is also inequality notation, and finally interval notation. Like I said before, there are three different notations. Set notation and inequality notation are very similar. The only difference is with set notation you will see a bracket, x, such that x includes all real numbers. Then you will just have your inequality notation ending with a bracket. Now don't forget that these x's could also be y's if we were talking about range. With inequality notation, you will just have a less than sign, or you will have a less than or equal to sign. And with interval notation, you will either be using brackets or parentheses. Don't forget that when stating domain and range, domain is always stated from the furthest left point to the furthest right point, and range is always stated from the lowest point at the bottom to the highest point at the top. For set and inequality notation, when your end marking is a closed circle, you are going to use the less than or equal to sign when stating domain and range. If your end marking is an open circle, you're going to use the less than sign. If your end marking is an arrow, which means that your function has gone to infinity, you're just going to leave that blank. If your domain or range, if both of those ends go to infinity, you're going to state the domain as x includes all real numbers, or range would be y includes all real numbers. Now we're going to practice using inequality in set notation. First, we're going to look at our domain, which we know is the x values. So we're first going to see what is the furthest left x value, which if I look here, I see that is -5. Then I need to pay attention to the end marking. I know that this is a closed circle, and because it's a closed circle, my symbol I'm going to use is less than or equal to sign. Next, I'm going to look at the furthest right x value, which if I look, I see that is 3. Once again, it is a closed circle, so I'm still going to be using the less than or equal to symbol. Now we're going to look at the range, which I know is the y values. So first I'm going to see what is the lowest point that my function goes. And the lowest point that I'm seeing is -3. And because it is a closed circle, I am going to use less than or equal to symbol. And finally, I want to look and see what the highest y value is. If I look, the highest y value is 4. And because it's a closed circle, I'm going to use a less than or equal to sign. Now, if we put this all together, I know that my domain is x such that x includes all real numbers, which is -5 less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to 3, and we're going to close that off with a bracket. And that is set notation. This part right here would just be your inequality notation. Same thing for the range. I'm going to use y such that y includes all real numbers, which is -3 less than or equal to y, which is less than or equal to 4, and end with a closed bracket. Once again, this whole thing I just wrote is set notation. This part right here would just be my inequality notation. When using interval notation, if your end marking is a closed circle, you're going to use a left bracket or a right bracket. If your end marking is an open circle, you'll use a left parentheses or a right parentheses. Finally, if you have a arrow, which means that your function goes to infinity, you're going to use a parenthesis with a negative infinity or a positive infinity with a right parenthesis. Anytime you're using an infinity, you always use parentheses. Now we are going to practice using interval notation. First, let's look at the domain, which we know is the x values. What is the furthest left point? That would be -8. And now we want to take a look at the end marking. Well, the end marking is a closed circle, so we know that we are going to be using a left bracket. Next, let's look at the furthest right point. If I look here, I have an arrow, which indicates that this goes on to infinity. And this is going to go on to infinity in the positive direction. And so I'm going to use a parenthesis. Now let's look at the range. The range we know is the y values. The lowest y value, if I look at this graph, this is going to continue downward, so the negative y value. So it's going to be a negative infinity for the y values. And I'm going to use a left parenthesis because this is the lowest point. And we know that range goes from low to high. Now let's look at the highest y value. The highest y value is going to be a +4, and it's going to be a right bracket. If I go ahead and state my domain, I have left bracket, -8, comma, infinity, right parenthesis. For my range, my lowest point was -infinity, which we know always includes parentheses, and my highest point was 4, and we said that was going to be a right bracket. The notation we've used here was interval notation because we've used brackets and parentheses. Thank you for listening, and I hope you guys have a wonderful evening. We will go over some more domain and range problems tomorrow in class.